Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the 250th episode of the show. To celebrate, I'm speaking to a very special guest. Not only am I a huge fan of his work, but he's also just published a highly relevant book that is one of the best things I've read this year. My guest is Ros Atkins. Ros is a BBC News presenter and the BBC's analysis editor. He's best known for his explainer videos, which since 2019 have become a global phenomenon, with vast audiences on social media and the BBC's digital TV and radio channels. Ros's book, The Art of Explanation, How to Communicate with Clarity and Confidence, is part autobiography, part history of his explainer videos, and a practical guide to how we can all be better at explaining things. I've been a fan of Ros's videos and presentation style since first discovering them a few years ago. Not only have they made me smarter about the world, but the techniques he uses are engaging, informative, and entertaining. So much so, in fact, that I've found myself recommending to my clients that they watch them as masterclasses in how to make complicated subjects interesting and compelling. In his book, Ros explains some of the techniques he uses to make his videos and shares some valuable lessons about how we can all be better at explaining things, not just at work, but also in our personal lives. So in our discussion, I obviously wanted to explore the subjects of explaining and explanations. But what also comes across clearly in his book is that Ros adopts a very entrepreneurial approach to his work. So you'll also hear on the episode about how he generates his ideas, sometimes taking inspiration from the most unexpected of places, how he gets buy-in for his ideas, and how he collaborates with people inside and outside the BBC to test those ideas out and improve them. I also wanted to explore a few of Ros's other areas of interest, so you'll also hear about texting Keith Olbermann, an amazing and very unusual BBC podcast that he recorded with his wife Sarah and US sports presenter Keith Olbermann, and the 50/50 Project, a highly successful initiative to support diverse representation in the BBC's journalism, which Ros started in the newsroom in 2017 and has now spread across the BBC and beyond. Finally, as you'll hear throughout the conversation, Ros is a big music fan and used to be a DJ, so we also explore his love of drum and bass, how music influences his work, and how he came to create a set for BBC Radio 6 Music. One more thing before we begin. While explaining how he likes to collaborate, Ros references a hypothetical project that he and I might be working on. I rather liked that idea, so I ran with it in the show. By the end of it, we agreed to collaborate on a Spotify playlist based on musical references in the book and the podcast. So when you've finished listening to this, you can head to the show notes and listen to that as well. Right, let's get on with the 250th episode of the Human Risk podcast, and it's an absolute thrill to be able to bring you my conversation with the fabulous Ros Atkins on the art of explanation. Ros, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And look, first off, let me say congratulations on the book. It's an absolute triumph. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. And I wanted to sort of just explore the format with you a little bit, because obviously what you're doing is explaining not just how to explain, but also explaining your story. And you've got this wonderful mix of a practical book, a behind the scenes on your explainer videos, a little bit of your life story. And you describe it as a cookbook, which I thought was a fascinating analogy.
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for your kind words, and thanks for reading it. Some of the dimensions of the book that you're describing were quite deliberate, and I'd pick out a couple, which is that there was this dawning realization once Wildfire, a headline, had very kindly agreed to work on the book with me, which was like, if you make a book that is evangelizing about the importance of clarity and high impact communication and accessible information and everything else that comes with it, needless to say, the book needs to be a manifestation of that. So I definitely felt the pressure to make sure that the book itself was a case study in all the things that are within it. So I'm relieved to hear that you thought that perhaps it might be. The inclusion of all of the more personal detail about experiences for me which have gone well or haven't gone so well, well, that was partly because I hoped it might be of interest, but it's actually something more than that. In the book, I talk about the importance of credibility. If you want to communicate effectively, whoever you're communicating with needs to see you as credible. And I'm not an academic. I haven't studied communication from that perspective, but I have worked in a profession which has required me to look at how to communicate every single day for 20 years or more. And it felt to me like if the reader was going to, especially a reader who maybe doesn't know me from the news, which of course is plenty of people, they needed to understand why I was suggesting what I was suggesting. And so the stories are included partly because I hope they're interesting, but also because it's me explaining to the reader I'm not just making this advice up. It's rooted in personal experience where things have gone well and where things haven't gone well. And so it was important for me to include that. And then the final thing about the cookbook, well, it's a comparison, I guess, which only goes so far. But the thing that I thought was that some of my favorite cookbooks and books about food and drink, you can read them from the beginning and you can read through them and it's an enjoyable reading experience. But that's not just what they're about because once you've read them once, you go back to them and you pick out bits that work for you and resonated with you and try and apply those to how you're cooking in that case. And my hope is that with this book, I really hope people will read it from beginning to end and enjoy it, but I also hope they'll be facing a situation in their lives, important meeting, a speech, a briefing paper, whatever it might be, and then go back to it and pull out the bits that were most helpful to them.
Well, you definitely succeeded in that, and there's a real sense when you tell your stories of experimentation. And what I liked about it was you were very willing to talk about things that hadn't gone well, things you had learned on the way. But it was a sense that your craft, if you like, had evolved over time, and that you got to where you got to now, and you got your ability to talk about, your ability to explain, had come from experimenting.
Yes, I'm an enthusiast of experimenting, and I'm also an enthusiast of realizing when one of my experiments isn't working. And I think especially as I've got a little more experienced and a little bit older, have been more and more able to divorce myself from the ideas that I'm spending a lot of time on. So I'm lucky enough that a couple of my ideas have become quite big and become quite successful, but I can give you a list, and some of them are featured in the book, of ideas which I've sunk a lot of time into, which in the end didn't work out. And I think it's both things can be true in that to make an idea, I was talking to a senior media executive here in the UK a couple of months ago, and he had a phrase which I liked, which is we were talking about when you can spot good ideas and which ideas to invest in and to back. And he said we can all have good ideas. It's whether you can make them into something that's the real test. And I like that because for me, having an idea is just the start of a very long and detailed process. And all the way through that process, I leave on the table the possibility that the idea might not work out. Like I never stop being open to that idea. And it's quite important to me that I share that idea with people who I trust to also tell me that this idea isn't working. And I think that if you can have that underpinning your experimentation, you can experiment with freedom because you're less bound up in the outcome and more bound up in the act of experimenting and developing the idea properly. And almost whether the idea is a success or not becomes not secondary, but a later consideration.
You talk a lot about the people that have helped you on the way, and there's a very clear sense in the book that what you produce is a team effort.
Yeah,
And
of
so I
course.
really I like this idea because I think it plays into principles of recognizing that we're all fallible, that we can all kid ourselves that things are a good idea, that we can convince ourselves of our own brilliance, and therefore we need those calibrating factors in our lives. You talk a lot about the processes that you go through and the fact that there is a great willingness to just express freely, and so you bring, I think, cognitive diversity from what I can read and into your teams, but also a willingness to speak out and a culture that allows that. And I think that for me is fascinating in a world where we see lots of people, particularly senior people, high profile people, where we sort of have this cultish thing where nobody dares challenge them. And I thought it was interesting that you've almost designed structures that will challenge you and therefore kind of bring out the best in you.
Yes, and it's done because I think it's the best way to develop my ideas. So I think it's the right thing to do, but it's also the best way to develop my ideas. And I think one word I would pick out there was you're emphasizing that we've created cultures within the teams that I've worked in where people have been able to speak frankly, about the merits of what we're doing. And that's certainly true. The brilliant team who helped me make Outside Source for almost a decade, we had a fantastic culture where anyone within that team was able to say to anyone else, I don't know if that worked today, or could we try it this way? And we have the same culture within the brilliant producers who helped me make our video explainers. But there's something I would add though, which is that with idea development, especially in the early stages, for me, it's not just about teams, because if an idea is brand new, there's no team around it. It's just an idea. And the thing that I've become more and more tuned into as I've experimented and had ideas that have and haven't worked is not necessarily thinking in terms of teams, but it's in terms of informal networks. And so, quite quickly, when I think I've got an idea which is worthy of attention, I'll try and build an informal network of people from a range of different disciplines, often within the BBC, but sometimes, depending on the idea, people outside the BBC too. And it's not formal. I'm not saying, hey, I'd like you to come and work with me for the next month, or it's literally me calling up people who I hold in high regard with different disciplines. And by the way, some will be very senior and some will be more junior, and they can both contribute equally. And I'll say to them, I've got an idea. I don't know if it's going to work, but I think it's worthy of attention. If I sent you some detail on the idea, would you be willing to would you be willing to talk to me about it, assess it? I'm not asking for very much of their time. And I'm also saying to them, I trust you to tell me things about this idea, which I promise that I will listen to. So it's a credible request. It's not, "Hey, come and make my stuff better, and then I'm gonna swan off and not involve you." And so if you take the idea of the video explainers, that is exactly what I did. I spent 6 months working up the idea on paper, and then we started to make some output, some television initially, which we clipped, that was following the principles that I had outlined for this idea. And every single time we made a clip, I would send that clip to this informal network of people who I'd sought out and had told about the idea. I said, I ran that idea past you in theory. Well, actually, we've started to do it in practice. Have a look. What do you think? And I would put in quite a lot of time having one on one exchanges with these different people. And they would, because we had a good trusting relationship, say, look, that bit just didn't work. Or like, yeah, that's really great. Definitely keep doing that. I'd gather all of that feedback. So there's quite a lot of feedback. Imagine if you're sending that to 5 to 10 people every time you make something. I would take all of that feedback, process it, talk to the people I'm actually making the product, the idea with, feed all that feedback in, and sometimes it's the next day or maybe it's the next week, we do it again with all of that applied. And then it gets sent out again to the informal network. And again, you get feedback. So it's quite an intensive process of development. And what's good about an informal network is if you send it to 10 people, 3 of them might say, I just can't look at it this week. I've got no capacity. And that's fine. I'll send it to them next week. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. There's no commitment, there's no obligation. So it's not, often I find when I go to talk to people about ideas, sometimes you can see they're thinking, is he asking me to commit to something? Is he asking me to say I'm definitely going to give them some of my time on a regular basis, on an ongoing basis? And for reasons I totally understand, that's not always a prospect people like. But I always go, look, I'm not asking for anything beyond if you have capacity, I would love to know what you think. And if you don't, that's fine. And that approach has worked really well for me. And then the other thing which I would say, so it's a long answer, but this is the crux of really the early stages of idea development for me, is that if you're in a big organization and you need an idea to flourish, you're going to need the backing of a number of senior people across the organization because they may have resources or they may have control of points of distribution in terms of media content, or they may have expertise that you definitely would like to access. And by sharing the idea with them earlier, you achieve 2 things. You improve the idea because they're all very good at their jobs. So they're going to have great thoughts about how the product develops. By listening to that expertise and feeding it into the idea, they hopefully feel like they have a stake in it or that they have contributed to the product. So it's not me going, I've got this idea, I just want you to help me make it brilliant. It becomes our idea, it's not my idea. And then also, when you have developed it further and there are decisions to be made down the track about, does this require resourcing? Are we going to distribute it? How are we going to distribute it? The people who are making those decisions about the product, and I don't assume they're going to make the decisions I hope they will. That's their, they deserve to be able to take those decisions without me passing judgment on them. But they know the product and the idea well, which means that they're going to take a decision from a really informed position. And then whatever the outcome is, that's entirely up to them because they're the bosses. But involving those crucial people all the way through achieves this, when it goes well, this double outcome of the idea gets better for their involvement, and they know the idea better when they have to take decisions about it that may decide whether it expands or not.
I love that because it's very entrepreneurial sounding, which, given what you do, on the face of it, it's quite surprising, right? You sort of say, well, in the news business, what's the opportunity to be entrepreneurial there? But the way you describe that is I think your I guess points to your natural curiosity, and you sort of want to improve your craft and do things, and therefore you're trying things out, and that requires it. But it is a very entrepreneurial approach, and potentially a structure and organization where one might not think of that existing.
I suppose, I mean, you're not the first person to say it looks like an entrepreneurial approach. I'd never, till people had said that to me, thought of it in those terms, but I can see why people might want to use that word. I would say, though, I don't see any other route. I don't see any other route to developing ideas properly. Like, I can't give you an example of an idea that I have had, which has been successful to some degree, which hasn't involved many people who I hold in high regard becoming involved in it and improving it. Because, especially within big organizations, but not only within big organizations, I just don't see how individuals in isolation can get an idea to its maximum potential or help deliver an idea once you've got it to its once you've developed the idea, then actually deliver it in terms of making it and providing it to whoever you're hoping to reach. I don't think that's something I could do, or even if I wanted to do it on my own, and I definitely don't. I don't think that would be possible. So I think it's the right way to develop the idea because I think it works, but it's also born out of necessity because I don't see any other route. And I would also say that I'm a presenter. So presenters are certainly senior figures within the BBC newsroom, and I'm not pretending otherwise. But quite rightly, and I emphasize quite rightly, we're not managers and we're not editors. We're not the boss. So we have a certain amount of soft power that comes from our positions, and I'm not denying that soft power. But in the end, I can't take a decision to put a budget behind an idea or create a team behind an idea, or uh, if I want to put a video on the website or put a video on the TV, I can't just say, "Oh, I'd like to do that." The editor of the website decides, the editor of the television program decides. I don't decide that. And so, as such, it's been partly born out of necessity in that I have to work collegiately, but for me, it's also the best way of working anyway because you maximize the brilliance of the people around you.
One of the things that came across in reading the book was a sense of curiosity, and I guess this plays into the explainers because the videos that you produce, the content, the way in which you present things is helping to answer people's questions. And so I got a real sense that you're curious about the world and you like to ask questions.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious about the world. I mean, I think all journalists, at the heart of any successful and good journalist is a burning curiosity about almost everything. And so yes, whenever I see anything happen, whether it's something's on my street or if it's something on the world stage and everything in between, I instantly go into why has that happened and how does that fit into the other things that have happened? And that's really, journalists are driven by a curiosity because curiosity takes you to questions, good questions about whatever the subject you're looking at. I suppose what I've tried to do in how I've worked is to not only be curious about the stories and the issues that we cover, but also curious about the mechanics of communication and the mechanics of idea development. And also, I'm a keen student of how large organizations work and how power and ideas get shared within organizations, and every organization works differently. There's no one right way of doing it. But it seems to me that you can't, just speaking as a journalist, you can't give your work as a journalist the best chance of having impact unless, as well as paying close attention to the story, you're also paying really close attention to how the organization you work within operates, and you're paying close attention to how the world consumes the type of content that you make, and you're paying close attention to what's happening in your industry more broadly. And those details outside of the day to day stories and issues that we cover are hugely influential in how I work. And, whenever I'm approached by a journalist who's coming into the industry and they ask for advice, one of the main things I always say is, of course, concentrate on the story. Of course, be curious about what's happening in the world, but also be curious about the organization you work in and be curious about the industry you work in. Because if you let your curiosity, your journalistic curiosity, uh, flow on those two latter points, it's going to benefit the work that you do on the stories themselves.
And one of the things I found fascinating after reading the book was you gave me a different lens through which to look at the world. And I found myself thinking about both the way I explain things, but also explanations that I receive or don't receive. And so it was, I go, for example, to a builder's
Mm.
merchant the other day, and I sort of thought, well, I was asking questions and they were perplexed as to the questions I was asking, but also the explanations I was getting made no sense to me. And you reference that in the book when we talk about explanations. It's not just in terms of formal structures, it's happening all around us. And as I started to ponder these things, it was almost becoming a little bit exhausting for me because I was thinking, well, is that a good explanation? Is it not? Uh, and so I wondered, is it tiring for you? Are you thinking in those terms, or is it me just reading the book and
Uh,
overthinking it?
so it's not tiring for me, but I am very conscious of how I'm communicated with and how I'm communicating in a lot of environments, not just working environments. And really, what you're referencing is one of the reasons that I wrote the book, because I think if I said to you or to anyone else, okay, you're preparing for a big job interview. Do you think you should think about some of the things that you're going to say in that job interview? Most people are going to go, yeah, of course. I'm going to prepare for that job interview. And when they ask me my experience of managing others or whatever the question is, it's probably a good idea if I think about it's probably a good idea if I think about that. And I don't think most people would not think that. But if I said to someone, in your average day, there are probably between 25 and 100, depending on how you work, moments where you are exchanging information with people in your day to day life, whether it's at work or outside of work, perhaps interacting with your doctor or whatever the example might be. And how often do you think about those? I think a lot of people might say, well, I don't think about those so much. When I'm just going into a quick meeting, I don't think about it that much. When I'm going to the doctors, I don't necessarily think about how am I going to communicate. And really, one of the reasons I wrote the book is that in my experience, being conscious of those moments too can really be transformative for the overall outcomes that you're trying to achieve, particularly in the workplace. And that you may not feel it, but that email that you're sending, if you get one response to it, it could open up something that affects the next few years of your career, or it might not. Or if you go to the doctors and you do explain the symptoms you're experiencing well, that may immediately get you the treatment or the responses that you want. If you don't manage to explain that, you might be back at the doctors in a couple of weeks, or there may be a whole bunch of administration that follows because you haven't managed to get that across, or you haven't managed to ask the questions that would be helpful. And so one of the cases I'm making is let's try and be more conscious of all of these moments. And then when I say that, I was giving a talk the other day about this, and I was saying this, and you could kind of feel in the room people were thinking, is he really suggesting that I stop and think about how I communicate, hundreds of times every month? And I kind of made a joke about it, but I was saying, essentially, I am saying that, but, and it's a big but, sometimes it doesn't take more than a few seconds. So the example I often give is sometimes I'll bump into someone at work and they'll say, actually, I needed to grab you about that thing that you were mentioning. Could you come and see me in 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it might be? And I'll go, yeah, yeah, sure. And just in those 5 minutes or even in 1 minute, I might just take 30 seconds to go, okay, hold on a minute. What is it that I really would like to pass on to this person? What am I asking? What information might I want from them? They may have a detail I've been trying to get. And crucially, what would I like them to do? And those three questions, what am I trying to pass on? What information would I like from the person I'm addressing? And what would I like them to do? You can often answer those three questions quite effectively in under a minute. And so, coming back to your experience of the builders merchants or 101 other examples, in that circumstance, that's not something you can control. But it sounds like you did know what you wanted when you went to the builders merchants, and that's a good start. So I often go into lots of situations armed with the questions that I would like to have an answer to. And my experience, I don't know how your experience was on that day, is that people don't mind. People don't mind encountering someone who's thought about what they would like to hear back from whoever they're speaking to. So yes, you do become quite attuned to how people are communicating, but I suppose, and obviously I've written a book on this because I'm not neutral. I'm not neutral, but I suppose the part of the book is to say yes, noticing it's not a bad thing, noticing it's a good thing.
But yeah, I mean, it really occurred to me as I started to reflect on it that there are so many rubbish interactions we have with people. And actually, if we thought a little bit more about what do I want to get out of it, we would have more satisfying encounters with people. And the number of times I've walked away from conversations or requests, things haven't worked out the way I
Mm,
was expecting them to. And to your point is I think actually, if one goes into in the way that you suggest, the sum total of sort of human exchanges improves significantly. We will get more of what we want. We'll have a more of a fun time, and we'll understand
yeah,
each other better. And it's a very very simple point, but I think you're right. And having read the book and tried these things out, genuinely felt I don't know, I just genuinely felt happier, and I did want to pay you a compliment. It sounds like a really simple bit of advice, but I think it can be game changing, particularly where we're dealing with environments where we don't know and we can't be expected to know. And you used the example of the doctor's surgery. Well, of course, we're not medical experts. That's
right.
why we're going to the doctor. And so this idea of bridging gaps and sort of knowing what we're trying to get out of something and recognizing when the explanation we've received doesn't make sense and therefore challenging in a nice way, I think is very, very powerful.
Well, first of all, thank you. And secondly, let's continue that example of going to the doctor because, as you say, the doctor knows much, much, much more than we do. But that doesn't mean it's not within our rights to be curious about why something the doctor's deciding to do doesn't sit with how we feel. And one of the most powerful things I think we can do, not just at the doctor's, but generally, is find ways of explaining what we don't understand, of finding ways of saying, I'm confused by this, and my confusion matters because I'm worried about this or I'm interested in that. And so I could give you lots of examples. I alluded to the fact that I had a couple of health things while I was writing the book. And I found it hugely useful to say to the doctor, I'm needless to say not telling you you're wrong, but at the moment you're suggesting that we do this. And to me, I don't quite understand how that fits with some of these symptoms that I've got. And that's causing me some concern. So could you help me understand it? And of course, they then do explain it. And of course, they know best. So what they're suggesting is good. But the act of sharing the thing that you're not sure about in a clear way means that you're much more likely to get an explanation back from them that addresses the thing that you're concerned about or confused by, which in turn makes you feel better informed. So the whole exchange it serves hopefully serves the doctor well, but it also serves you well. And the thing that I hope comes through in the book, and I feel very, very strongly, is that to communicate effectively isn't simply about pursuing your own goals. It's not just about you. If you communicate effectively, it's good for you, but it's really good for the people you're communicating with. If I am doing a piece of work with you, Christian, and I send you a foot-long email that doesn't really explain what we need to do next with the imaginary project that we're working on, not only do I not to get to push that project on because I've not explained what I need to get done very well, but you have to spend 10 minutes wading through the email to realize that I haven't done that very well. So it's a cost to you too, right? And there's this phrase that I discovered this when I was writing this book, this incredible academic called Todd Rogers at Harvard, who I'm sure would be a fascinating guest for you on this podcast, actually. And he specializes in studying how people consume short pieces of written communication, emails, WhatsApps, text messages, and so on. And he calls poor written communication and unkind tax, which is a phrase that, profoundly resonated with me. Because when you communicate poorly, whether it's a talk or an email or whatever it might be, you're not going to get the information across that you want to. You're unlikely to spur the actions that you would like to. But on top of that, you are actually placing something on someone else. You're requiring them to do the work to try and find out what you're saying. And needless to say, people don't like that. Or to be much more positive about this, if let's continue this imaginary project we're working on, if you got a really short, really clear email from me which said, Christian, I've done these two things. These are two outstanding things I need, more information on. And is it possible that you can do this and this? And it takes you 30 seconds to read that. Needless to say, the chances are that you are going to reply to that. Doesn't guarantee you're going to do what I want, I hasten to add, but it gives you a much better chance that you are going to tell me what you're going to do.
I'm looking forward to this project, by
Yeah,
the way,
yes, we
whatever
need
it
to
is.
come up with it.
Sounds like a lot of fun. Maybe we'll get there by the end of the show. The examples you give in the book around the emails, I thought was super interesting because one of the sort of preconceptions I had was that the book was going to be all about formal communications. And you've given, the lovely examples, and you're absolutely right. If you go to a website and you can't find the information you want easily, or you get an email that sort of you have to fight to comprehend, it's deeply irritating, and it's just a waste of everybody's time. And so I hadn't thought about it at the same level, but the skills that one applies in that formal context also apply to these other more informal exchanges. And that for me was blind again. It was lots of things you said in the book are blindingly obvious with hindsight, right? But there's that's the craft of what you do, right? Is explaining things in ways that sort of obviously you understand it afterwards, even if you didn't before. And making obvious links is sometimes very powerful.
I can't. Thank you very much for your kind words, but your broader point that sometimes really helpful advice can be kind of sitting there in front of you. I definitely have found, any number of times over. I think the thing I would just emphasize is that, and we've kind of alluded to this already, but for reasons that are completely understandable, we tend to focus on the big moments, the job interview, the big set piece speech we're giving, the monthly meeting with senior colleagues, whatever the example might be. Needless to say, they really matter. But in my experience, and let's go back to the idea of developing ideas, developing a successful idea that's going to be around for years is hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of little moments. And a successful idea coming to fruition and being successful at scale, for me, is the end outcome of really a huge amount of small actions. And without those small actions, the big moments, the big meeting with the boss where you say, will you put some funding behind this idea? That big moment only really happens and only really delivers after the event, even if you get the answer you want, if these hundreds and hundreds of smaller actions where we are communicating clearly, where we're aligned with the overall purpose of our communication, where we've thought about what information we do want to pass on, what information we probably don't need to pass on. And so that's why I am, as you can tell, reasonably passionate about the smaller moments as well as the bigger moments. And it's why the book is full of advice, not just for the big set piece moments in our lives, but also how we operate on a day-to-day basis.
One of the things that, and again, it was obvious with hindsight, particularly having read the book and gone back and watched some of your videos, is that when we think about communications, often we are on, pun slightly intended, broadcast mode, and we sort of think, well, this is what I want to tell. What you point towards is that it's as much of an art as it is a science, and the creativity that we bring to presenting it, that I think shines through. When I rewatched some of your videos, I suddenly realized that there are lots of theatrical moments in there, pauses, you use single word sentences, lots of things in there that point in an artistic direction. And I guess I'd always thought about clarity as being a scientific discipline. Let's be very, very clear. But what you highlight is that actually there's a craft. And the reason we need that is because we're communicating to human beings. We're not programming machines. We're trying to get a message across. And that requires us to think much more artistically.
100%. I mean, I think I say at some point in the book that for me, explanation is about style and substance. You've got to have the substance. You've got to have information that is helpful, that is relevant, that is distilled, that is easy to consume. All of that is essential for quality explanation and communication. But just having that information on its own may not be enough. You may also need to think about, and I would argue almost always do need to think about, how are you going to deliver that information? And then that comes down to thinking about who you're communicating with, which might seem like an obvious thing if you are about to give a big speech, but actually, are we thinking on a day to day basis? This email's going to this person, so they're going to need this information. In this meeting, these people already know about that, that, and that, so I don't need to go into that. But the next meeting, people don't know about that, that, and that, so I do. And so calibrating, you collect the information, you then calibrate it for the people that you're passing it on to. And part of that calibration is, what are the ways that I can give people this information that makes it most likely that they're going to want to consume it? Now, one of the reasons they might want to consume it is because it's relevant to them. There is a second reason, which is they might just be really interested in what you're telling them and want to hear more about it. And that's where the storytelling comes in. And there are lots of different techniques. And as you'll have seen, I put quite a few of them in the book, that ways of making people want to know more and enjoying knowing more. And you're quite right to observe that how I've gone about that, I've taken inspiration from here, there, and everywhere. And the reason is that, needless to say, journalists don't have a monopoly on how to communicate. Doing the news is one way of communicating. It's not the only way. There's communication happening all around us. And one of the things as I was getting going as a presenter that I became much more conscious of than I ever had done before was spotting people who are communicating well in whatever field: comedy, entertainment, drama, politics, business, you name it. I was just my antenna were up. And, in the middle of a moment where you're not really expecting it, you suddenly think, hold on, that was, that really held my attention. And maybe what did they do there? And I'd kind of wind it back and go, okay, that's what. And so being aware of how other people are doing it, even if it's outside of whatever industry or specialism you work on, is something I found really, I found really, really useful. But you have to be in the mode, you have to be in watching mode to spot those clues. And one of the revelations for me when I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and I was getting going as a presenter a little bit was, of course, I could go on training courses and they would be really useful. Of course, I could seek out advice from brilliant presenters and that would be incredibly useful. But actually, all around me in my life were amazing pieces of advice about how I could communicate better. I just hadn't been watching out for them. And so I started watching out for them and I still watch out for them. So what you've observed in the videos is me deploying different techniques of communication and storytelling, some of which I've learned from brilliant news broadcasters, but some of which I've learned from other places too.
It fascinated me watching your videos. There are things that if you looked at it on the written page and out of context said, a BBC newscaster is going to say this, you'd think that's bizarre, right? It's almost, it feel out of context feels inappropriate. And yet it feels entirely right. So I was thinking I was rewatching the one with Boris Johnson where he messed up his speech and started blathering on about Peppa Pig World. And you were highlighting the fact that he had paused and then you paused. It's very, very, very powerful in the moment and really helping to sort of drag us into the sense of what it must have been like to be there listening to him. And it was a very, very simple device, but it's not one, as you say, I wouldn't traditionally associate with a newsreader. You sort of think newsreaders are going to keep talking, and actually you're using very theatrical devices in a context in which we don't see it that often.
So I think you're right that some aspects of my delivery are outside of what you would expect from a traditional news broadcast. I suppose the only thing I would push back at gently is that BBC News and journalism more broadly, but let's say BBC News, since its inception, has always had the same goal, which is to tell you about things that have happened in our world and to explain those things and to do it in a way that works for your life and fits into your life. So, needless to say, when we were starting out, radio and then television were the ways that we were doing it. And since the 90s, we've been doing it digitally as well. And as the means by which we can deliver journalism to people has changed, and as the habits and expectations of our audience has changed, of course, how we manifest our journalism also needs to change. But actually underpinning what we're doing, whether it's one of my videos now or a BBC News report from the 1960s and everything in between, the ambition remains the same, which is tell people what's happened in their world, why does it matter, what do they need to understand it, and give it to them in a way that fits into their lives and makes them want to listen or watch or read more. Those ambitions are the same. All that's happened, all that I tried to do with our videos was to say, how can I still pursue all of those goals? Nothing's changed about those goals, but how can I pursue them and deliver them in a different way that might be well suited, in particular, to digital consumption? And as I considered that, some of the delivery techniques that I used on more classic TV programs didn't quite work, and I experimented with others that might work in this new environment. But I would emphasize, because I think it's worthy of emphasis, is that when we make our videos, the scripts get looked at, but everything gets looked at. We want to create a product that feels fair and factual and all of the things you would expect from BBC News. And I was very mindful that as I experimented with slightly different delivery techniques, for example, that we still ended up in a place that was doing all the things that we would always want to do, and we were very kind of careful about that. And obviously, we're happy that we do that; otherwise, they wouldn't be in the public domain. But it's something we're very conscious of, and I think if you experiment, this is one of the kind of interesting dynamics that I've come to understand a bit better, is that if you experiment and your experimentation takes you outside of what might normally be done, I always proceed with extreme caution. So, on one level, those explainer videos might look like a reasonably bold innovation in that it's quite different, and people notice the difference and like the difference. But underpinning that is actually a lot of caution in that as we experimented, if at any point we felt we were in any way even risking a low risk of compromising those fundamental goals of BBC News, we wouldn't do it. Because actually, the core purpose of our organization is very precious, and it's appropriate to experiment with how we deliver on that core purpose, but it's also appropriate to be incredibly respectful of it and cautious about it. And so, in and amongst this new product that we've got going, which people have been very nice about and have highlighted from an experimental point of view, there is also a lot of caution, and there should be a lot of caution.
And I think it's interesting when you talk about risk management in that sense of clearly you don't want to do anything that's inappropriate, but you still want to be creative in the way you're engaging things. And it struck me that you could look at it and say, well, there are all these constraints on your ability to be. You can't just freewheel, and there's a lot of effort that goes in behind the scenes to check things and all the sort of things you'd expect. But it struck me almost that those constraints are potentially quite helpful in the sense that we know that whenever we have massive constraints on us or things that could be perceived, that actually helps breed creativity. And I wondered actually if that wasn't very helpful to you in the sense that if you had free reign to do whatever you wanted, that might not produce the same type of output. And therefore, are the constraints actually helpful?
I think that's a really interesting question. So I think they have been helpful to me. I was just thinking as you were saying constrain, I was like, am I going to quibble with Christian using the word constrain? And I am and I'm not. So clearly the BBC has rules of around impartiality, which I completely agree with, and they are constraints. So the word you've chosen is accurate. There are things that we can't do that other news broadcasters can do. The only reason I was going to quibble with it was not because it's not accurate, because it clearly is, was that I don't think of it as a constraint. I don't walk into the BBC and think, "Oh, I'm just so frustrated that I can't go on air and shoot from the hip on a range of subjects." I don't want to. Like it's not I've got no desire to. It's not like I'm forcing down this desire to kind of shout my opinions from the rooftops. I don't think my opinions
Right.
are very interesting at all. And so I never thought about and still don't think about impartiality as a constraint because I want to be impartial. No one's forcing me to. I'm convinced of it. Um, but what was interesting was that, and to answer your question more specifically, go back to 2019, summer of 2019, and I had a conversation with my then editor who essentially said, I want you to think about your TV format and like what you want to do with it next. And she said, you could even think about, I had a big touchscreen at the time. She said, you could maybe even think about not having the touchscreen and what the format would be without this. And I thought, okay, these are reasonable questions to ask. I was kind of open. I wasn't expecting you to say it, but I was kind of I was open to that. And it prompted me to really zero in on what I felt was a problem with my work, which was that I'd created a TV format which, by most measures, was successful, outside source, but I'd created it with two goals. One goal was to create a TV program that could access information from the digital world very swiftly and get it onto the TV, and the touchscreen had allowed us to do that. And I felt, by most measures, that goal had been achieved. And my second goal was to create a TV program which routinely generated successful digital content. And by any measure, I wasn't doing that. The clips that I was putting online were doing poor numbers. I wasn't happy with the performance of the clips at all. Of course, that was on me. And I started to think, well, what do how do you fix this problem? And obviously, it wasn't an easy problem to fix. So I spent quite a few months reading and watching and thinking about it. And one of the big conclusions I came to was that at that point, and this is still true to some degree now, one of the biggest growth areas for journalism where audiences were flocking was opinion. Opinion driven journalism was proving very popular. That's not a problem for me. Opinion journalism is a perfectly valid form of journalism, and people wanted it. The challenge for me was I couldn't be in that game. I can't express any opinions. So I was like, okay,
Right.
so particularly in the digital arena, opinion is a massive driver of content and individuals' popularity, journalistic content. How can I compete when I'm not allowed, when I can't do the thing that is allowing some other journalists to become incredibly popular? And I decided to try, and this is a long way of answering your question, but it's hopefully useful. I decided to see if I could make my inability to say an opinion the strength, the thing that made me different and the thing that made me competitive. And so when we started to develop the video format, I wanted to be really bold with the language I was using, really direct about what was true and what wasn't true, really helpful in terms of explaining how stories fitted together. It became known as assertive impartiality, which was a phrase a colleague of mine came up with. And I wanted to make that direct language a strength. But the thing that really made it a strength was I was saying, I'm going to be this direct, but I'm always impartial. So I'm not interested in one side or another of a story doing well or not. I'm not in this game. My commitment is to telling you what's true, what's not true, what's happened, and how it fits together. And to emphasize that, I decided to deliver all of my videos exactly the same way. So it sounds like you've been watching a few of them, Christian. I doubt you'll be able to highlight one that has a very different delivery to another, because my delivery is pretty consistent, whatever the subject matter. And one of the reasons I decided to do that was that I wanted to make the information itself that I had collected with the help of my brilliant colleagues, I wanted to make that the thing that differentiated me. So I wasn't going to shout and scream because I couldn't compete with some of the people who were on air being very passionate. I wasn't going to give you an opinion because I couldn't do that. So I couldn't compete there. I was going to let the potency of the information itself be the star of the show. And that was my idea. And one of the reasons I ended up on that idea was partly to come right back to the question you asked, was partly out of necessity, because I was looking at a problem, which was, how do I compete in the digital arena without opinion? And to solve that problem, and a problem which was partly because of the rules that the BBC rightly has, I ended up somewhere which I wonder if I worked somewhere where I could express opinions, where I wouldn't have thought to end up there. So that's a very, very long way of saying, that's a
No,
very long
I
way of
love that.
saying
That's
that
really,
that
really
I
interesting.
think we do get creative when we are in when we can't do anything that we want to do. There's no doubt that moment can drive creativity. Um, yeah, there's a story. In fact, I was thinking about this the other day, and I'm going to look this up and double check it's correct before this podcast goes out. But I did a feature on BBC Radio recently where you pick a couple of important songs that one that's been given to you by your family and one you're passing on to your family. And one of the pieces of music I chose was the Colne Concert by Keith Jarrett, the jazz pianist, and it's incredibly famous, sold thousands and thousands of records, and I think it's one of the best-selling jazz records ever. And the story behind it, I think this is correct, is that he wasn't happy with the piano at the Colne Concert, and that because he wasn't happy with the piano, particularly, I think, the higher and lower notes, he decided to play much more in the center of the keyboard than he would normally do. And as a consequence, the style of improvisation that he did was partly dictated by the fact that the piano wasn't to his liking. And so the music that was created was a little bit different to some of the music he may have created on other concerts when he was improvising. And so I think the story goes, and we should look up to check that this stands up, but I'm pretty sure this is correct, that his creative response to something that he wasn't happy about led him to creating this extraordinary piece of music, which has now been listened to by millions of people.
Hi, it's Christian here. I just wanted to interrupt the recording to let you know that, true to his reputation for accuracy, Ros did indeed fact-check this point after we'd finished the episode. I've shared a link to what he sent me in the show notes, as well as a link to a fascinating interview with the promoter who organised the Colne Concert by who else but the BBC. And if you haven't heard the Colne Concert, do listen. It's an astonishing impromptu performance. Right, with that fact check over, back to the show. And as you say, it's a great bit of music as well. We started on music, which leads me naturally to have to talk to you about your love of drum and bass, which when I first found out about this, and I think it was because BBC Six heard about the fact that you'd been a DJ and decided to offer you the opportunity to have a show.
Yeah, I think I got asked about it. I think it was an interview in The Guardian a couple of years ago or so. And I think a producer at Six Music saw it, and they had a feature on Steve Lamac's program on Six Music where they invite people to do guest mixes for 30 minutes. And they dropped me a note going, would you be willing to do one? And
yes,
of course, I said yes before they had a chance. Said yes before they had a chance to change their mind.
But what I found it amazing about it, because on the face of it, I just went, "Oh wow, I wasn't expecting that." And then I actually thought, it's fascinating because you talk about not being able to bring opinions into things, and therefore, on the one hand, you would say, well, BBC newscasters, we don't find out that much about their personalities, but there is something in your style of presenting that your personality does come through. And therefore, when I heard about your background, I actually thought, well, that's not inconsistent. And so couple of thoughts on that is, one is, if somebody else were to read your script, I don't think they would do the same thing you do with it. So we do get a sense of your personality. But the second thing is on the drum and bass piece is, it struck me that putting a DJ set together, in many respects, is that some of the things that you do for that in terms of flow and engaging audience also comes through, I sense, in your...
Very, very much so. I mean, I spent a long time with my friend Ollie, who's, been a partner in crime on lots of drum and bass and dance music related things for a long time. We sat in this room in my house, in fact, once Six Music had asked if I'd like to do this, with a bunch of piles of records everywhere, and of course the computer up as well, and running through any number of tracks. And when you're putting a mix together, you're not just saying, I can't remember, I think there were 10 tunes in that mix, 9 or 10 tunes. You're not just picking your 9 or 10 favorite tunes. That's not the criteria. The criteria is they've got to be 9 or 10 tunes you think are great, but also you feel stitched together in a way that they complement each other when you're in the mix, but they also take you somewhere from where you've been already. And so, yes, we spent ages, chopping and changing the order and thinking about how that mix would work. And sometimes when you're doing something like that, you get to plan a mix. Of course, if you're DJing at a party or wherever it might be, you might have a few runs of tunes that you normally do, but you're also responding to what the crowd's doing. But yes, a lot of the work that I do, obviously I do much more. I mean, I'm a very, very amateur DJ, so I don't want to overstate this, but whether you're constructing a set or whether you're constructing an explainer video, you're essentially saying, what's the information, what message do I want to communicate? What's the information I've got in order to do that? How best to organize that information so that it makes sense and is coherent and the pieces of information interact with each other? And also, crucially, who is this for? Because needless to say, the set that you would build for one crowd would not be the set that you would build for a different event, equally, if you're making a piece of journalism, who you're making it for really is fundamental to the decisions you make about the information. So all of that, um, complements each other quite well. And I think that, as I'm sure you noticed as you read the book, I reference music quite a lot.
Yeah.
I have taken lots of inspiration in terms of how I communicate verbally from music, and it often helps me. There have been lots of moments where something I've been wrestling with in terms of how I communicate in my work and wasn't really cracking. I have found the answer through either hearing music or, more often than not, hearing people who make music talk about making music. That has been invaluable on any number of occasions. So um, yeah, I mean, I do a lot less DJing than I do making videos, but both of them in their own ways are about carefully constructing something so that it works for whoever you're trying to communicate with.
And I loved it because it gave me the perfect excuse to listen to some great albums
There
and
you
watch
go.
music documentary. I don't need an excuse, but it's nice to know that I'm doing it in furthering my own communication skills as
Well,
opposed to just enjoying myself.
my favorite of all of the things that I mentioned in the book, and it's a really, really important moment in my career, funnily enough, was when I was watching this Steely Dan documentary about how Steely Dan made their best-selling album Asia in the 70s. And this documentary, it's one of those kind of classic album documentaries, and they're interviewing this session musician who played on one of the biggest tracks on that album. And he has this incredible turn of phrase, and he's sitting in this, suitably LA scene with the palm trees and the pool and everything. And he says, Steely Dan, they used to make you rehearse and rehearse and rehearse until you get it absolutely perfect. And then they say, okay, now we're going to play it, or words to that effect. And his point was that you master the technical side of it and the musical side of it. But then that in itself doesn't make a great performance. Once you've got to that point, then you have to perform it. And for me, that captured exactly, better than anything I'd managed to do, what I've been trying to do with my videos and with Outside Source, which is first you work out what you're trying to communicate, you gather the information, you distill the information, you organize the information, you think about who it's for, you get it as tight as you possibly can. But coming back to our earlier point, this is about style and substance. All of that is the substance. But then if you don't think about, once you've done that, how you deliver it, you risk not giving yourself the best chance of passing that information on. So that's a good example of how something I could feel myself wrestling with, but didn't quite know how to express it or how to see it. What unlocked that was randomly watching watching quite a long and brilliant documentary about an album that was made in Los Angeles in the 70s.
Love it. And there's, as you said, enough musical references. There's a lovely soundtrack, I think, to be had to read in the book. So I would recommend anybody.
Yeah, maybe that could work, I suppose.
So we should put together a Spotify playlist so people can dive in and listen to that
there
as
are
they're
there are a
reading it.
few. Yeah, I'm trying to think who we talk about. Phoenix, the French band. We talk about Steely Dan. Joni Mitchell, I think, comes up.
Yeah.
So there's a few different references.
I will. I might maybe I'll make that little project, Ross, and go and pull
I'd be
those.
very
references out
flattered
and
if you would.
create one for you. The other thing I can't let you go without talking about is that there's an amazing podcast that you did about your relationship with Keith Olbermann. And can you just tell firstly, for people who don't know who Keith Olbermann is, that'd be helpful to know that. But secondly, how did that come about? Because it's an amazing, well, I was going to say a bit of radio, but audio product, incredible.
Thank you. Well, Keith is a very big name broadcaster in the US. He first made his name as a sports broadcaster, particularly on ESPN, and was really one of the most high profile and innovative sports broadcasters in the States. And he then shifted across to news, and he's probably best known for the work that he did on MSNBC. It was really integral to MSNBC becoming a major player in US cable news, and Keith was one of their most high profile presenters. So I knew all about him, especially as a news presenter in the 2000s when I was getting going as a journalist. I'd heard of Keith, and lots of people had heard of him. And one day when I was on air on Outside Source, I came off air, and I think there was a tweet by Keith Olbermann saying, good to see you on air, or I'm glad you're back. I think it was the first show back after a holiday. And I thought, is that someone who's, just using the same handle on Twitter, or is that actually Keith Olbermann? And it was. And I sent him a note saying thank you very much, and we started exchanging messages initially on Twitter, and then we exchanged numbers, and before I knew it, we were texting each other a huge amount about quite a range of things, and it was quite strange. And uh, I would kind of joke with him about the fact that it was a bit strange, but it was also I enjoyed it, and I think he enjoyed it, and we stayed in touch, and I became so kind of intrigued and fascinated by what we both were doing that I asked him if I could record a conversation about the fact that we were doing it. And I said to him, I don't know, I think this could make an interesting podcast or program, and I'm not sure exactly where it will go, but could we record something? And so a few weeks later we did, and I found it fascinating, and Keith was very good to give us, lots of time to record that conversation. And I played it to a couple of editors who they weren't my managers. They were just people who I knew from the audio side of the BBC, who I knew made really interesting stuff. And I said, I'm not quite sure what this is, but I'm pretty sure it's very interesting. And they said, it is. So I said to Keith, could I keep recording conversations with you? And he said, yes. And so that carried on. And then the kind of other dimension to it, which was equally unlikely, was that because at the time I used to get home at about 11, quarter past 11 after doing Outside Source, and quite often I'd be in touch with Keith after the program. And so my wife Sarah would often be in bed by the time I got in, and I'd kind of get into bed and we'd catch up on the day. And quite often when we were catching up on the day, I would be getting messages from Keith. And so it became a bit of a running joke that she would say, is that Keith again? And I would say, yeah, it is. And I was replying. So let me make it absolutely clear. I was, just as enthusiastic about texting Keith as he was about texting me. And so I said to Sarah, could I record a conversation with you about what you think about the fact that I'm texting Keith a lot? I mean, I really mean a lot. I mean, I may have been texting my wife Sarah, more than Keith, but he was either number one or number two in terms of the people I was communicating with. And she said, okay. So actually, the night before the first conversation with Keith, I recorded quite a long conversation with Sarah in bed about what she thought about the fact that the next day I was going to be recording quite a long conversation with Keith about the fact that we both texted each other. And I took the recording of me and Sarah, and that recording I've already referenced of me and Keith, to a couple of BBC radio people and said, I think this is interesting. I think it's very unusual. I think there are possibilities here to get something that's quietly gripping, or quietly like that's it's interesting. I played it to, and let's come right back to where we started the conversation about developing ideas. One of the first things I did was think of a few people, different people at the BBC, just who I hold in high regard and whose opinion I would like to hear. And I just gave them the two recordings of me and Sarah and me and Keith, and I said, I'm not sure about what exactly this is, but I think there's a interesting podcast here. And they all came back and said, we don't know what this is, but it is interesting. And so with Keith and Sarah's agreement, we recorded some more conversations and we turned it into something.
And it's just an absolute pleasure to listen to. And if you'd said to me, you're gonna listen to this podcast about a bromance by text message that also involves one of the couple's wives, I probably wouldn't have gone for that. But there's just something delightful about it. So I will put a link into the show notes.
Please, thank you.
I just love the way this comes about, and I think this is really indicative of your experimental style and just sort of sensing there's something there and running with it. But it's, as you say, it's strangely compelling, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you very much indeed for listening to it. It was a one-off, and sometimes ideas sometimes you have an idea and it comes to fruition and you think, well, I can build on that idea and create other things beyond it. But that podcast felt like a really interesting idea that happened, and it's always rewarding when people such as you say they've listened to it and enjoyed it. But we made it, and that was that.
Love it. More, please. Not necessarily that, but do keep having these creative ideas.
Thank you.
Before I let you go, Ros, I do want to talk about the 50/50 project, which I
Mm.
know you mentioned in the book, but I think is incredibly important. It'd be wrong of us not to cover it. Can you just quickly tell people about that?
So the 50/50 project, we started on Outside Source in early 2017. The idea was to increase the representation of women in the BBC's, initially in the BBC's journalism. It's since gone on to be not just about journalistic content, but also about media content. And it's also, having expanded across the BBC, also then started to work in other organizations in different parts of the world. But in the early days, I'd been thinking about the fact that I was aware that Outside Source was I was pretty sure not 50% female contributors, and the fact that I wanted to try and do something to change that. And I did a BBC trip to Silicon Valley in December 2016, and we spent a week there, and within reason, we were able to visit whoever we wanted. So we went to see news organizations, we saw academics, we saw tech companies, and lots of other people besides. And there were two big themes that came out of all of these fascinating conversations, diverse range of conversations, but there were two big themes that really came out of it. And one was the degree to which people were using data to influence behavioral change. And the second was the degree to which small multidisciplinary teams can drive quite substantial change across big organizations. And both of those caught my attention. And on the plane back from California, I started to think about, well, how could you take those two pieces of advice and apply it to this challenge that I felt we had with our program, which is the entire team was bought in, of course, to the idea of having a program which had at least 50% women contributors, and was also bought into the idea of trying to do more to change that. So I thought, well, how can I combine these things together? And I, on the plane back, sketched out what became the 50/50 project, which is essentially a simple system of self-monitoring where you systematically measure what you're doing every single day, and you share that data every single day as a way of driving awareness of, well, first of all, giving you information about how you're doing, and then also driving awareness of your work towards the goal that you're heading towards. It was a bit more complicated than that, but in its simplest form, um, it was about measuring what we were doing every day. And to my delight, it started to work. And over 3 or 4 months, the contributors on Outside Source changed, and some other people in the newsroom heard about it, and I was talking to some other people as well. And then some other programs said, well, we would like to try this as well. So I said, okay, well, let's, here's how we do it. And to my excitement, their numbers, their range of contributors started to change, and organically it started to spread across the BBC newsroom. Now, I should say that was a while ago now. That was 2017, and by 2020, I stopped being in charge of it. And in the recent years, it's been run by a range of absolutely exceptional BBC colleagues, and now it's a BBC project, which I don't. Of course, I'm still in touch with them and talk to them, but it's run by the BBC and run by a brilliant team. But yeah, that's how it started.
Love it. And I think just it speaks to your entire way of thinking, which is this sort of creative, innovative process. So definitely worth a mention. Brilliant initiative. Love it. Thank you so much. And I say this to all of my guests, but in your case, I absolutely 1,000,000% mean it. Thank you for what you do, because you have made me wiser, smarter. And I know that you're not producing entertainment, you're producing news, but many of your explainer videos do bring a smile to my face. You've made the world a better place. And I think in a world where we need explanations for things, you are helping to provide them. So thank you for that. Thank you for writing an incredible book. And you've just been a fabulous guest.
Well, thank you. Those are exceptionally kind words. Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure being on your podcast.
So the first project we will do together is I will get that Spotify playlist based on what you've got there, and then maybe we can get some ideas from you for some other tracks that would be sort of Atkins-esque, that would make a suitable accompaniment for people
Let's
who
do
are
it.
reading the book.
I'm all in on that. I don't need any persuasion to assemble drum and bass tracks, Joni Mitchell tracks, and Steely Dan tracks, and a few other things besides. That sounds great.
Amazing. We'll do that. And in the meantime, book out very, very soon. In fact, by the time the podcast comes out, the book will be out, so comes highly recommended. Links to all of the things we've talked about in the show notes. But above all, thank you so much, Ros.
Christian, thank you.
So that's it for the 250th episode of the podcast. My enormous thanks to Ros for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Ros, his amazing book, The Art of Explanation, I honestly can't recommend it highly enough, and all the subjects we discussed on the show, have a look in the show notes. You'll find links to some of my favourite explainer videos there as well, and a link to the Texting Keith Olbermann podcast and that Spotify playlist we collaborated on that features songs from and relevant to the book and the podcast. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Pod, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. I love hearing from my listeners, so whatever you think about the show, good, bad, or indifferent, do get back to me and let me know. It all helps to make the show better. And please do also leave a review on whichever platform you're using to listen to the show. They really do help. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, have a look at the show website, humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back with the 251st episode of the show very soon. But in the meantime, stay safe. Thank you so much for listening. And remember that when we explain things well, we're better understood and more likely to get the results we're looking for.